Welcome to the France 24 debate. Xi Jinping was adamant when he met Joe Biden, telling him that Taiwan was a red line he would not cross. Biden was equally clear, saying he wants no misunderstanding between Washington and Beijing. The two men met ahead of the G20 summit in Bali, and there's a lot at stake for the pair. In spite of Biden stating there's no Cold War between China and the USA, there's not a lot of love either. Biden's $3 billion military aid package for Taiwan may not help thaw the situation. Taiwan's foreign ministry adding, we are seeking to deepen the Taiwan-US security accord. It's a common Taiwanese viewpoint that they don't want to become an Asian Ukraine. That's how they feel about the constant Chinese military exercises spinning in their airspace. Such is the fear, then, in Taiwan of that impending attack from China. There is, of course, much more to discuss. Let's, without any further ado, bring in our panel. Here in the studio, Anne-Marie Brady, Professor of Chinese Politics at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And here in France, what are you doing? Remind us.
I'm at ESM in Paris.
Okay, great to see you. On the other side of our studio, they're not necessarily against, it's not that kind of show, Andrea Lusicra-Pietri, who's president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Thank you, sir, for coming in. Great to see you.
Good evening.
Joining us from Zurich, Zhongluan Liu, Fellow for International Political Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for joining us. And in Brittany, Philippe Lecour, Research Fellow at Harvard Kennedy and Visiting Professor at ESSEC Business School. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. We'll let the panel loose after this report from Catherine Kedder-Clifford.
A highly awaited handshake between the world's two most powerful leaders. Though US President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping have spoken several times over the phone, this was their first face-to-face meeting. It came as bilateral relations are at their lowest in decades.
Currently, the China-US relationship is in such a situation that we are all concerned about it, because this is not in the fundamental interests of our two countries and peoples.
Ties are currently marred by disagreements over a whole range of issues. Firstly, there's Taiwan. Washington's openly against Beijing's One China principle, and tensions mounted in August when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited the island. Following 3 hours of discussions, Biden said he didn't believe China had imminent plans to invade Taiwan.
I made it clear that our policy in Taiwan has not changed at all. I made it clear that we want to see cross-strait issues peacefully resolved, and so it never has to come to that. And I'm convinced that he understood exactly what I was saying.
Another point of contention, North Korea. Joe Biden wants to push China to use its influence on Pyongyang, which has just carried out a record series of missile launches. Biden said if Beijing's not able to rein in North Korea, the US would move to further protect its allies in the region. Then there's the war in Ukraine. Though China says it takes a neutral position in the conflict, it hasn't officially recognized Russia's invasion. Washington would like Beijing to distance itself from Moscow. Another touchy topic is trade. President Biden hasn't yet lifted the tariffs imposed on China by Trump.
A report by Catherine Kedder-Clifford setting up this debate. Thank you all for being with us, and don't hesitate to join in at any point. Anne-Marie, I'll start with you. What's your sense of how things are between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping?
Well, I think it was really a repeat of last year's virtual talks. Not much progress. Both sides made their positions clear. It was interesting that you highlighted that the Chinese side emphasised we're not in a Cold War. I've been reading the Chinese language readouts as well as their English language readouts versus the White House statement, and they've all got different. They're issuing different information about what happened. I would love to have been a fly on the wall, but I think I'm most interested in the Chinese language version. And that one does say that there's a Cold War going on, and now is the time for the US to do what it did in the early 70s, which was to change the US-China relationship. So I just think there's an interesting series of messaging going out for different audiences, which is quite typical of the CCP. The White House statement's very, very clear and detailed of what was said. The Chinese statement's really lacking on the detail.
So it was Biden who said there's no Cold War, but you're saying from the Chinese side of things on the official release, there's a different narrative coming. Let's cross our studio and bring in Andre on this one. Andre Lusacru-Pietri of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Andre, your take on the situation, because clearly we're hearing from Anne-Marie that it's more of the same. Are you seeing any differences, any kind of glint of light coming through which gives you some room for hope?
Well, maybe on the substance itself, I think we are seeing maybe China being back the ultimate pragmatist. I mean, it's interesting to see how both leaders were all smiles. Everybody showed a little bit, even if with Xi Jinping less used to that, trying to demonstrate some kind of a bit of a power pause and who is putting himself. So I think that's interesting because it's basically the two superpowers meeting again after a very long eclipse. And the last thing on the pragmatism is I think the Chinese are also seeing that the table is turning in Russia, in Ukraine, and Russia retreating from Kherson these couple of days. And I think they realize that it's maybe time to slightly adjust the language. We saw that especially on the pretty strong statements the two leaders did on the nuclear issue. So I think China, that used to be the big friend of Russia just 9 months ago, is slightly making its position evolve. So maybe a return of the pragmatism, which we all welcomed China for.
Indeed, Andre. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Zurich and Zhongguan Liu, Fellow for International Political Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Zhongguan, thank you for being with us. In terms of what we're seeing and hearing coming from this meeting, do you get any sense that there is more of a closeness between these two men? Do you get the sense that maybe there's some way of mending the relationship, which has been quite fraught in recent years? Or do you think really that the standpoints are really just still too far apart?
Right. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great honor. And I would highlight 3 points from my readout. The first would be, I do see both from the White House press release as well as the Chinese version, in particular the Chinese version on qiushi.com, to say both parties, both China and the United States, recognize that the relationship is need to move towards a better relationship, needs significant improvement. And then secondly, both the White House press release as well as the Chinese version, they emphasized that the two leaders, Xi Jinping and President Biden, agreed to continue the conversation, to resume the dialogue, which is significant in the sense that for both China and American policymakers in the past, especially during the pandemic, a major frustration and the source of distrust was from the lack of direct channels of communication. And more specifically, the two leaders agreed that Secretary of State Blinken will visit China to follow up with the conversation. So that is the second major progress. And then finally, I would also highlight that despite that the Chinese version did not specifically talk about the condemnation of the possibility of a nuclear war, but the White House press release did talk about and use the word agreement to see Biden and Xi Jinping reiterated that their agreement with regard to nuclear war should never be fought in the context of Ukraine. So I think these three aspects do highlight relationship improving. And on top of that, both leaders also emphasized that the current relationship deterioration is not in the interest for the United States or for China.
So, Gwan, thank you very much indeed. Bear with us. We'll come back to you very shortly. Let's go to Brittany. Philip Lecour waiting for us there. Research fellow at Harvard Kennedy and visiting professor at ESSEC. Philippe, they spoke for 3 hours. Talks described as candid, in-depth, honest, direct. As Anne-Marie said, it would have been nice to have been a fly on the wall to hear what they actually said to one another. What's your sense?
Well, of course, the fact that they are talking is already a good beginning, since they have not done that for a while, except through the phone. And honestly, we've reached a low point in August when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, and was rebuked by drills and exercises by the PLA in the Taiwan Straits and around the island of Taiwan. I think 3 hours is a long time, but it was short of details in many ways. I think it was a sort of big picture meeting, and with two principal angles. The first one would be the main concern of the Beijing government. And by the way, we are dealing with a man, Xi Jinping, who has just been reappointed for 5 years as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. This is no small feat. And we're dealing with a man who had not a clear victory at the midterm elections in the US, but at least, he secured the Senate in the US and comes short of a majority in the House of Representatives during the midterm elections. This is also important in sort of fly in the room discussion or elephant in the room sometimes when we think of Vladimir Putin, perhaps. But I would say that the key themes were one on the Chinese side, Taiwan, and one on the US side, let's call it the international order, and who's going to define what the international order is. And of course, on one hand, you had Xi Jinping saying, well, I'm not going to change the international order. And on the other side, you had Biden saying, well, we haven't changed the one China policy. So, we have not changed our attitude and our policy, despite all the things he said over the past year or so, including while visiting Asia.
Philippe, thank you very much indeed. You've brought up Taiwan, which is where we go next. Anne-Marie, Biden, knowing, as he says, he wants no misunderstanding with Xi Jinping nor with Beijing, but as he's saying that, he knows he's got this $3 billion military aid package for Taiwan up his sleeve, which he's going to hand over. Taiwan's foreign ministry saying they're seeking and happy to seek to improve and deepen the security arrangements with the United States. I mean, clearly, this is a clash point going forward between the US and China.
Well, the US has been providing weapons for the Republic of China and Taiwan, since that's been the location for the Republic of China. So, and particularly this was something that continued on after the US recognised the PRC. The US Congress passed the agreement to protect Taiwan in case it was attacked. So this is not unusual. China doesn't like it, of course. The PRC doesn't like it. But it's completely predictable. And Biden has, more than any other president, made it very clear what is and has been the US position, that it would defend Taiwan if it was attacked.
But it's Xi Jinping saying that it's a red line that shouldn't be crossed. What does he mean?
Well, they may say that, but Deng Xiaoping also complained when the US provided weapons to the Republic of China on Taiwan, even after the US had recognised the PRC. So these are just words. I don't think that it would lead to anything in particular. We've seen lots of shows of force into Taiwan's air defence zone, repeated incursions, and a whole lot of other pressures, military-related pressures. But there's also massive political pressure on Taiwan. One of my areas of research is foreign interference. United Front work is what the CCP calls it. And Taiwan's got a very bad case of it, which, subversion from within is the threat. So, talk of red lines. I mean, the Biden listed quite a lot of red lines in what we can see in the White House readout. And it is in some ways a repeat of what was said last year. It's what the Biden administration would call the guardrails. So there's language coming up from both sides on this.
So it's language, rhetoric, perhaps not going as far as. But can I bring you in now, Andre? Two correspondents from France 24 went to Taiwan, spoke to the president. have produced a documentary. And I spoke to them before starting this program. They said one of the great fears that many people come up with there is that they don't want Taiwan to become an Asian Ukraine situation. And that's what they fear will happen. And if that's what people feel, clearly there's a sense that that is grounded on something, based on something, such as something they have imagined.
Yeah, I think we just exited a dangerous situation. I mean, I want to stress again what Philippe Lecor just mentioned about the fact that I was about to say the same, is we have two leaders who come out pretty strong of the last couple of weeks. Pretty expected for Xi Jinping, pretty unexpected for Joe Biden. So actually, in diplomatic terms, it's always a very good moment when leaders are relatively reassured about their own standing, and that's probably a good moment to engage in talks. So I think we are seeing a relatively interesting situation. And regarding Taiwan, look at also what happened in the last 9 months. I think my personal opinion will be that what happened in Ukraine is actually a very stark warning against any kind of invasion using military force. Add to that to the fact that invading an island which is very heavily defended, much more than was Ukraine was in February, is probably a deterrent for the Chinese. So I would say actually Taiwan's situation is probably a bit more strong. The risk is obviously that time is running out. I mean, all economic indicators, demographic indicators, and even probably social indicators, with the pressure still on with zero COVID, makes the pressure mounting, and what some Americans call the dangerous decade until 2030, where at one point there might be a risk of an invasion. One point I want to stress, which has not been debated here, let's not forget that during Pelosi's visit, one of the consequences was that the cooperation on climate has been suspended between the US and China. And we're in the middle of COP27. The real breakthrough would be that this is re-engaged. And I've not read the Chinese communique, but it's not appearing in the White House communique, that this critical important topic for which the two powers need to agree on will be reinstated. That would be a real signal.
I think I read that, though I may have dreamt it. So that's just basically try and see whether we can get some clarification from Song-Kwan Liu in Zurich.
It has been mentioned, Mark. It certainly was mentioned in the White House, not the specific cooperation they're talking about, but it was mentioned as a point where the US and China could seek cooperation. So I think that's alluding to what you mentioned there.
So possibly some progress on climate, which is
I would expect
obviously a good thing.
They're looking for some common points, that's for sure, right now.
Obviously a good thing. Let's bring in from Zurich Song-Kwan Liu from the Council on Foreign Relations. Song-Kwan, you've heard what's been said about Taiwan. I mean, clearly this is something that both parties are concerned about. But most concerned, of course, are the people in Taiwan. They're worried about what might happen to them. What can you give us on that?
Thank you very much for this important question. On the issue of Taiwan, I do think that I would want to warn against any assumption thinking that the CCP, the Communist Party of China, or mainland would change or relinquish its use of force because President Xi Jinping, or Party General Secretary Xi Jinping, he has reiterated it during 20th Party Congress and in the previous years, as well as in the Chinese statement, in the sense that China does not want international or would oppose any international interference or external interference with regard to the issue of Taiwan. And he stressed that the Taiwan issue needs to be resolved by China as a domestic issue. In other words, there is no change with regard to what the party's line with regard to Taiwan before. And then on the other hand, I do agree with our other panelists' point with regard to right now, probably the pressure on Taiwan is being released or downgraded a little bit, in the sense that on the one hand, yes, indeed, both leaders have already secured their domestic domestic politics in the sense that foreign policy originates from domestic politics, right? So once both leaders feel a little bit at ease with regard to domestic politics, they would have more degree of freedom to talk about bilateral relations. And Taiwan would be the point where both parties would pressure each other more severely in times of uncertainty. But once domestic politics settle a little bit, the pressure on Taiwan would be released. But I have to emphasize that America's point with regard to Taiwan is not for Taiwan's interest. It's not in the interest of Taiwan. America does not make Taiwan policy because of the interest of Taiwan. Instead, it's really about what America's strategic interest in the Asia Pacific. So from that point of view, I would say, given that Taiwan is really not the low-hanging fruit in U.S.-China relations, the low-hanging fruit would be resuming of climate dialogue. And as Anne-Marie pointed out correctly, the Chinese version does emphasize possible collaboration or cooperation on the on climate issue. And on top of the climate issue, both the Chinese version of the press release and the White House press release also emphasized the importance of food security cooperation between the United States and China.
So, Ron, can I ask you just one more question on Taiwan? Because our correspondents who went there, of course, spoke with many, many Taiwanese people of ordinary level, sort of workers, whatever, right up to the president. And they're saying that China really has no claim over the country and should have no claim over the country. It's not even like Vladimir Putin's claim that Ukraine is part of Russia. It doesn't even go that far. It's not even that near. It basically is an independent place. It shouldn't be part of China at all. Would you agree with that? Is there a sense in that?
I think that particular question really depends upon who you are asking for. So as early as 1949, when the KMT retreated to Taiwan, remember the slogan from ROC at that time, Chiang Kai-shek and his associate was saying that they are going to reclaim mainland. So as generations of Taiwan people mature and older generations are replaced by younger generations, the mainland identity get diluted one generation after another generation. And then on top of that, there are also the kind of a political regime differences. Therefore, for the younger generation of Taiwanese people, they might not necessarily identify themselves with the mainland.
Song Guan, thank you very much indeed. Philip Lacour in Brittany. I hope you can still hear us, sir. So, am I understanding correctly? China has no claim over Taiwan. It shouldn't be even trying to sort of take over there. It would be a hostile invasion if it went to get there. It wouldn't be claiming back its territory.
Well, that's what they've been saying since 1949. But of course, they've been insisting on this even more so since Xi Jinping became a party leader. And certainly that's what he said during his speech at the 20th Party Congress, that China will never give up the will to take over the island, and that Taiwan was part of its the territory. Whether they would use force, I think, is the real question. They say they would integrate the island one way or the other, and they would not necessarily use force, and that there are different readings for that. I think the Taiwanese, of course, if you look at various surveys, the vast majority, over 70% of the Taiwanese people, having seen what happened in Hong Kong, particularly for the past 3 years, particularly in 2019, do not want to be ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, and certainly it hasn't helped the case for Beijing in Taiwan. But I agree with the previous speaker that this is not a decision for Taiwanese, sadly. I mean, in a way, both superpowers are making decisions based on their interests, and which is why I wanted to come back to that meeting that just took place at the G20. It is not by chance that Xi and Biden are meeting just a day before the opening of the G20, because in many ways, Taiwan may be a Chinese issue, according to what the CCP is saying, but the right platform to exchange between the Chinese leader and the US president is a multilateral arena. Now, of course, this is going to be followed up by a visit by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to discuss real issues such as food, climate, global governance, and so on. But Xi Jinping wants to show that he's back. He's back in the international arena, and that he's talking to the U.S. president in a sort of multilateral context. And I think it may be a way to have a sort of to de-escalate the relationship, but it's primarily a way to show that he's actually the equal to the U.S. president, and therefore he has to be respected in this sort of G2 relationship, as it appears increasingly.
Indeed, if you look at the trade deficit, though, it would be very tempting to say that Xi Jinping is actually the senior partner. I think it's something like a $420 billion trade deficit between the two. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anne-Marie,
You mean between the US and China?
between the US and China? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think Andre's point about the state of the Chinese economy is more relevant right now. I mean, the figures between April and June, zero growth. And have we seen the GDP figures yet since the 20th Party Congress? I mean, Xi Jinping's in big, big trouble. And we can't see any way out for him on economically. What will happen was when they release the COVID controls, there'll sort of be a natural return to some growth. But they need at least 6% growth just to get by. And unemployment for young people is just so dire. China's really in a bad situation right now. And it's all thanks to Xi Jinping's wonderful policies.
What, the actual sort of zero COVID policy?
Yeah, well, his COVID policies, his foreign policy, his domestic repression policies. Yeah, he's killed the goose that laid the golden egg.
Can I just get you to clarify for us the situation of Taiwan? Because I'm trying to sort of get this straight in my head. Part of China or not part of China?
It was only from 1945. China has had different regimes. So if we talk about the People's Republic of China, it's never been part of the People's Republic of China. It was part of the Republic of China from 1945. But even then, the Taiwan independent line would say the legal status was not completely determined. It was in the Potsdam Declaration. It's one of those World War II big conversations of the powers. About the status, the future status of Taiwan, which had been a Japanese colonial possession for 50 years. And before that, in the terms of Chinese history that we famously hear, 5,000 years of Chinese history, Taiwan had a relatively short, the island of Taiwan had a very relatively short period within the Chinese dynastic history. It was taken over at the beginning of the Qing dynasty because it was used as a base to defend the Ming. So this is in the 16th century. So a couple of hundred years. And the Qing government had a very loose policy on Taiwan. So Taiwan identity, which has become even more pronounced with the democratization movement of the last 40, 50 years, really has very, very different roots from mainland China. And that mainland consciousness was very superficial and imposed by the KMT after they came and took over Taiwan from the Japanese. And they were an incredibly ruthless regime for the first 20 years. They had martial law for 20 years, and they suppressed local culture and local language. And what we see now actually is quite remarkable, this vibrant democracy that enables to have a peaceful power transition when there is elections. We have some quite different views on Taiwan, but they resolve those disputes peacefully. So Taiwan has very much a distinctive identity, and the claim for it being part of the PRC is certainly debatable, and a Taiwan independence person would give you chapter and verse on those debatable points.
Let me go back to Director Song Hwan Liu of the Council on Foreign Relations. Song Hwan, thank you for being with us. You were saying earlier about how since 1949, and I think that's when the real sort of like nub of the problem comes from, as we're speaking about it, generation after generation, things have got a bit different and things have been watered down a little bit in terms of how people think. Nonetheless, there is still a problem there. Is there another aspect about this, that China perhaps sees Taiwan as a way of boosting its economy, a way of perhaps getting it out of this problem area that it's in right now?
That's a very interesting angle in terms of the economic relationship between mainland and Taiwan. I would say when people think about relationship between mainland and Taiwan, a very important part of that would be cultural and economic. Right now, the tension point in the U.S.-China and Taiwan situation, people tend to think very specifically the issue of the semiconductor industry. And some policy analysts would even say the reason why mainland really is interested in Taiwan is because of the semiconductor industry. My take on that would be, yes, the semiconductor industry is certainly an important angle because it's part of the strategic industry and a strategic pillar for China's industrial upgrade going forward. However, from the mainland or from Beijing's perspective, the Taiwan issue is and has always been considered as the part of China's internal domestic politics. And if you look at how the China's relationship management, Taiwan affairs is not a part of the foreign ministry hierarchy. It's not. It's managed by Taiwan Affairs Office under the internal domestic politics bureaucracy. Therefore, from mainland perspective, Taiwan issue is domestic politics, and layered on top of that would be economic interdependence. And if you ask me, in between Taiwan and mainland, from economic perspective, who is more dependent on whom? I would offer a little bit of cautious warning against any assumption to think that Taiwan can easily ignore the market of mainland China, because from a tourism perspective, from food, water, and even from supply chain perspective, Taiwan and the mainland are actually part of the same market. And if you ask the Taiwan business people, a couple of weeks ago, I did have the opportunity to talk with some Taiwan policymakers as well as business community, and I got very candid feedback. The people literally responded to me, how about being Taiwan business people? How could the best scenario for us would be we make money from both mainland and the Western market. In other words, the Taiwan business community, they do not want to be forced to choose a side. And certainly this applies to many U.S. allies, broadly speaking.
Ing-wen, thank you very much indeed. That phrase you used, choose a side, brings me to the next question. That's if I can move on. Unless, Andre, you have something specific about Taiwan. I was going to ask about Ukraine, because Xi Jinping yet to sort of really condemn what Russia has done in Ukraine. Clearly, Biden would be hoping that he would actually do that. But of course, he's on the fence at the moment.
No, maybe just to comment on what has been said about the G2 versus G20. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, we will see. But multilateralism is definitely not dead, but at least in very bad shape since a couple of years. And I'm wondering if actually what we just saw between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden is not kind of a prelude of what we're going to see in the next couple of years. By the way, it's interesting. We talked about 3 hours between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. I heard that our president, Emmanuel Macron, has a glorious 20 minutes. I even heard in a taxi with Xi Jinping. So maybe you will measure your power with the number of minutes you get with the Chinese president.
20 minutes at a taxi,
but
I like it.
That should be, again, with Chancellor Scholz visiting alone China 10 days ago, or just a week ago. Probably a wake-up call also for the Europeans. If you don't want to be completely obliterated in international affairs, you rather work together.
Indeed. Let's take a listen to Ursula von der Leyen, who's been speaking at the G20 about the fact that Vladimir Putin won't be there, and her relief at not having to be face-to-face with the Russian president.
I would also have wished to meet him here, because it's always better to say face-to-face what the issues are, what the objections are, what the criticism is. But, of course, his decision is his decision.
Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Council. Let's go to Brittany. Philippe Leclerc is there, a research fellow at Harvard Kennedy and visiting professor ESSEC. Philippe, would you have hoped that Xi Jinping would have come out and said, yes, he's against what's happening in Ukraine?
Yes, of course, but he won't say that because strategically, China has no interest in siding with the United States or with the West. This is not at all what it's trying to achieve. As I was saying earlier, I think China is trying to recreate a different international environment, or at least to take the benefit of what's to be taken in the current international order and to add on with its own institutions and ways of thinking, if not tools. If you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, the AIB, the Shanghai Cooperation organizations, and things like that. By the way, the last time President Xi, Secretary General Xi, visited a foreign country was in Central Asia at the SCO meeting, where Vladimir Putin was present. So were a number of other leaders. So in a way, this visit to Bali is interesting because it's at the G20 and it is an international forum and he's meeting the US president. But perhaps the previous meeting, the previous foreign journey that he took just a few weeks ago in Central Asia was as significant as he was meeting a number of allies, including Vladimir Putin. And he will not say publicly that he disapproves Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. He may say a few things like he did with the German Chancellor 2 weeks ago when Olaf Scholz visited Beijing, that both countries are against the use of weapons of mass destruction. But he did not comment on North Korea, for example. This is another subject that came out at the meeting today. He's very pragmatic. The Chinese Communist Party is a very pragmatic organization that really tries to use international tools as they come, but he doesn't see how he could help and how he should help US President Biden or the West for that matter. And therefore, as long as Vladimir Putin is hanging on there, and despite the terrible things taking place in Ukraine, he will remain officially neutral, and he will try to explain. And the Chinese officials, you talk to them, they explain to you that there's no full alliance between China and Russia, but at the same time, it's a friendship without limits. So if you understand this reading, then of course you'll understand the next what's going to take place in the next 10 years or so.
Indeed, and as Philippe, you put it, that there's that relationship. No sooner had the invasion been launched by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine back on February the 24th. Shortly afterwards, and I think it was already in the pipeline, but nonetheless, the optics kind of like say more than actually what happened. I think big energy deal signed between Russia and China, which of course went in some way to kind of compensating for the sanctions being put on Moscow over Ukraine.
Right. Well. I mean, China, in many ways, has not tried to counter the sanctions, and it is benefiting from Russia's international weakening, you could say. But at the same time, don't forget that China is trying to counterbalance the U.S. Soaring relationship. I mean, the bad relationship it has with the U.S., with Europe and with other markets, particularly the European Union. So, in many ways, it does have to hear the message from Europeans, and that was the point of Chancellor Scholz's visit 2 weeks ago, in order to save this relationship with the West, and particularly, as the United States is sort of standing alone more and more, and looking at, as we discussed earlier, looking at preserving its interest in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you very much indeed, Philippe. Andre, can I bring you back in? You mentioned Emmanuel Macron getting 20 minutes in a taxi with Xi Jinping. how many of those 20 minutes do you think he might have spent talking about human rights and the Uyghur situation? Do you think that would have come up, do you think? Because clearly this is something that we, as journalists, always talk about and try to publicise. You know, France 24 has done documentaries on the whole situation. One wonders kind of where this stands in terms of how world leaders view their time, FaceTime with Xi Jinping.
Well, again, I'm not going to be the fly in the taxi or wherever it happens, but I fear 0 minutes to that, because I think Western leaders have lost any hope, especially after the 20th Congress, that the situation will evolve. Again, I mean, I started that, and Philippe reiterated. Are we seeing a more pragmatic China? Are we seeing a more ideological China? What we see on the economy is definitely a destruction of the model. We seem to see that the CCP is trying now to navigate international waters. The one thing I would disagree with what has just been said is I'm actually not so sure that China is coming out much stronger of that. I think the big winner of the last 6, 12, 18 months is the United States on all fronts. I mean, never the US has been stronger in its influence all over, starting with Europe. I think the limitation of the Chinese policy, especially in Africa, has become clearer now with, you know, loan disagreements, etc. Just have to look at the situation in Sri Lanka. Trying to structure, remember, I mean, when Jim O'Neill coined the term BRICS, BRICS today has no meaning anymore. I mean, India is playing a total different game. Brazil is now on a completely different stance. South Africa has a little bit disappeared from the face of the world, at least economically speaking. So I think China is actually pretty isolated. And indeed, now Xi Jinping is trying to gain again its role, because China is indispensable for climate, which is the big threat of the next, not decades, but the next years. It's an immediate threat, and I think everybody is realizing that. And secondly...
I just want to jump in, though. Yeah. If Macron did not mention Xinjiang and Uyghur situation, he would be unusual amongst the Western leaders. Even my country, New Zealand, which is not usually outspoken in its criticism to the People's Republic of China, our Prime Minister mentioned it in her talks with Xi Jinping. So, you know, we've heard from Macron this idea of geopolitical independence, so, which is not even geographically correct. So perhaps it's possible that he was different from the other Western leaders, but actually I would expect that he said in person a similar message. There has been a lot of convergence, and I do agree with you, in Europe and in the Pacific, even in the Pacific Island states of the Pacific, not just Australia and New Zealand, in looking at how China is behaving and the strategic risk it imposes on all, but also the really dire human rights situation, which is on a par with, you know, people are saying on a par with the Holocaust in terms of the damage to the Xinjiang, to the Uyghur people. So I would be astounded if President Macron hasn't mentioned it, because it is one of the issues that is, it cannot be ignored, no matter the situation after the 20th Party Congress. I think it still is being raised, because pressure does matter on China. This is what Amnesty International will tell you. When people who've been detained and helped by Amnesty International, that external pressure is crucial. If we are silent internationally and don't raise these issues, the situation gets worse. So the leaders must speak up.
Just to make it very clear, that was neither what I hoped for. Is I just worry that in this world of real politics, some would call it cynical politics, some leaders have lost any kind of hope of change. And again, we have an emboldened leader who is now almost president for life or secretary general for life. And I think that if you want to put pressure, you need to put the tools in place to put pressure. And I don't see, especially not the Europeans, putting themselves in order to exercise real coercion like the US are doing right now. I mean, when you see at the latest measure of the US on semiconductors, your point before on economic might, I mean, today China can be, I mean, some sectors of China can be completely disrupted just by a simple decision of the United States. Just look at how ZTE was basically removed from the scene, and Huawei, once a giant, is now not anymore the giant that it used to be. So the Europeans are not at all putting themselves in. I wish they would, but that would be the only way for them to have an influence, not only on economics, but also on human rights, which I hope for.
Andre, thank you very much indeed. Andre Luz-Pietri, President of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, thank you for joining us. Thank you to Philippe Lecour, joining us from Rennes in Brittany, Research Fellow at Harvard Kennedy and Visiting Professor at ESSEC. Thank you to Zhongguan Liu from the Council on Foreign Relations, joining us from Zurich. And thanks to Anne-Marie Brady, Professor of Chinese Politics at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to you all for watching. Stay with us here. More to come on France 24.
The history of our world